In this episode, you join me at Old Huff Fishery in Cheshire, where we'll be going into detail of both method feeder and pellet feeder. The lake I've chosen to fish today is Big Mac's. Now the venue has an island around 35 to 40 metres away on every peg on the venue, and it lends itself perfectly for feeder fishing. We've got a shelf on the near side which drops down into the deepest water, and then from 15 metres up to the far bank it starts to shelve up, which makes it perfect for this style of fishing. You'll have a hard bottom and all the way to the island from halfway out, which lends itself to fishing a feeder line short and tight to the island, and that's what we're going to be doing today. The first thing I'll go through is the rod selection. For this type of distance, 35 to 40 metres, a short 8-9 foot rod is not quite long enough to get the accuracy. What you're after is a 10 or 11 foot rod. And that's why I've chosen our new Arcotech rod today. 10 foot in length, it's our carp feeder rod, and it's perfect for hitting that kind of distance. Too short, so you haven't got the casting power to get there, and too long, you lose a bit of accuracy. So that's the reason for this rod choice. Now the good thing about these rods as well is they're a little bit more adaptable than most. What we've incorporated is a section here which has got no rings on it whatsoever. So if you are falling short of the distance, what you can do is take that off, put the dolly section on, and all of a sudden within seconds you've got a longer rod to hit a further distance. I think that's a brilliant feature and is one that will help you out to make sure you're getting the correct rod selection for the distance you're trying to cast. Another great feature of these rods, which lends itself to feeder fishing, is what we've called trigger tips. Now all these is a much finer tip than what you usually associate with a method feeder rod. And by finer, I mean not only the actual thickness at the end, but the taper of the carbon is also a lot less. And what that allows you to do is have a softer tip. Now, you've always got to tighten up to your feeder when feeder fishing so you can see the bites, and it also helps with the bolt effect, which we'll run through later. But the stiffer the tip, and I've got no understanding why, but the stiffer the tip leads to less bites or actual hooked fish. Having a softer tip always catches you more fish, and it's a great feature on this rod. Now heading down to the reel, what I've got is a 4000 reel. It's perfect for this type of fishing. The right size spool to get the correct cast in, and I've coupled that with 8-pound M-Tech line. I like a nice, strong, robust line with little stretch. A finer line, not only you're risking cracking off with casting, but you've got more stretch as you're trying to land the feeder in, which means you won't be as accurate. So always go for an 8 or a 10-pound main line. first major skill to master with this type of fishing is the casting. Now, this is something that a lot of people struggle with, but it's important that the feeder enters the lake in the right manner. By this I mean it's not going in too hard, because all your bait will fall off the feeder and it won't sound right to the fish. It just sound like a brick going in, for example. So I'm just going to run you through the simple process of how you cast. So the first thing you do is obviously take the bail arm off, keep the line trapped with your finger, and then you're going to be lining up with a far bank marker. What you'd always do is pick where you want to cast and keep everything in line with it. And then you get the rod in a bit of a pendulum movement, and make sure that the feeder is past your tip in this direction before you start to bring your rod back, just to keep everything in a straight line and clean. And then once you're in a straight line, you bring the rod behind you and then you push forward quite hard. It's actually quite a hard cast you're looking for with method feeder fishing, because the thing that you're going to be doing while your feeder is in mid-flight and coming to the end of its travel is sweeping the rod right back to almost behind you to cushion the feeder. And what that does is, during the flight, the feeder's going to slow down and then fall in the right way. Rather than hitting the water in that angle, you're trying to get it to stop and fall down almost vertically. And that's the ideal way of getting your feeder into the water. So let's put that into practice. So we're lining up, putting the pendulum, sweep the rod back, push forward, cushion, feeder in. Once we've mastered the casting, we need to find where we're going to be fishing. Now, this is a venue that I've not fished before, so there's several avenues of which you can sort of go down to find out where you're going to be fishing. The first is the obvious one of talking to a bailiff, somebody who knows the venue intimately, knows where the fish get caught on a regular basis and knows the lake. They're great sources of information and the best place to start, really. Now, the next thing you can do is actually start to have a cast around and have a look for the features, the depths, etc. Just by chucking about with this and counting how long it takes for the feeder to hit the bottom, casting out, and once it hits the bottom, feeling whether it's rolling down a shelf. Because basically, with method feeder fishing, what I'm after is shallow water. It doesn't matter if it's flat or on a slope, but what you can't have is something where the feeder won't hold, because you have to cast out and the feeder stay in one position for you to get a bite. So what I'm going to do is have a little cast about and have a look for some features. Now, I've got an island about 35-40 metres there, which is the most obvious place for me to be fishing. So I'm going to have a cast over there and see whether it's deep against the bank, shallow against the bank, how far that shelf sort of extends down to, and what the water's sort of doing, really. And that's going to give me the best idea of how to approach this peg on the day. So this is how I'd go about it. To do my sort of exploratory casting, you cast out, hold the rod back and hold the rod high and just see how long it takes for the rod to sort of bounce back, and that's when the feeder has touched bottom and the tension's off the line. So obviously the longer it takes for your rod to bounce back, the deeper the water is, basically. So that way I can sort of establish where the shallowest water is in my peg. So I'm going to do that quite a few times just to establish what the lake bed's doing, and that'll give me a clue of where I'm fishing. Now on this peg here, it looks as though there's a big shallow platform to the left hand side of the island as we're looking there. And that's going to be a brilliant place to catch some fish. It's somewhere where the feeder can go in, sit in one location, not roll down a shelf, and it's the right depth of water for this time of year to catch in. With it being sort of 17, 20 degrees and at those temperatures for a long period of time, the water's going to be warm and the fish are going to want to sit in shallow water. That plateau looks to be about 2 to 3 metres wide to the left hand side of the island there. And also note that it's probably 2.5 to 3 foot, sort of 10 metres from the bank, so that's a nice gradual slope up to the island, and that's going to be somewhere that's worth fishing also during this session. And finally, looking for obvious signs of fish activity and movement will give a great indicator of where to cast to. Now let's move on to the feeders themselves. Choosing between a pellet feeder or a method feeder can be confusing for many. So here's a couple of the principles that I follow to try and help you decide. Looking at the two feeders, they are very different in terms of design, although they've both got lead weights at the bottom, so they're going to be landing one way down. The method feeder is far more open than the pellet feeder. So the properties that it gives that is that the bait is going to be accessible to fish on 360 degrees of that feeder. And it's also more exposed to water, which means it's going to break down or fall off the feeder quickly. Those properties lend itself to two things. That's for fishing in shallow water and for catching fish quickly. And that's because of that fast breakdown rate and it being more accessible to the fish over a slightly larger area. Now conversely, the pellet feeder, with the fact that it has a casing over the top of it, means the bait's only accessible once it comes out the feeder to one side or the front end. Now that keeps the bait a lot tighter, which means it lends itself to when you're getting less bites basically, because your bait's spread over a smaller area, then you're more likely to get a fish come in and pick it up in one go, because your hook bait is definitely in your pellets at all times. It hasn't spread off the feeder. Also, being encased, that means your bait is going to fall off far slower, which again lends itself to catching less fish on a harder day or fishing in deeper water. So in summary, method feeder, in my opinion, shallow water and on good days when the fish are actively looking for food. Pellet feeder is for deeper water or when the fish aren't feeding as hard and you're getting far less indications and bites. And that's the two principles that I follow. Now for me, there's never been a more simpler way to tackle up for fishing. You've got your 8-pound M-Tech line, you thread that onto your feeder, which is a tube through the middle, so that leaves it free running up and down the line. And then you tie the line to one of the quick change feeder beads, which is one of these. What that does is provide something for the feeder to stop against and also to attach the hook length. It comes in two different parts which open up and allow the hook length to be fastened securely. Now the hook lengths I'm using today are the new Bandham Method Feeder 4-inch pre-tied hook lengths from Middy. These come with everything that you need for a day's feeder fishing really. You've got 8 method feeder hook lengths, all with bands or with the bayonets etc. to hook your bait. They even come with one of the quick change feeder beads, so everything you need is right here. And they're also the best length for method feeder fishing, which is 4-inch. Nice short length which allows the fish to hook themselves against the weight of the feeder. So that's as simple as the rig needs to be. A 4-inch hook length, a hook, a bead and a feeder. The only other thing that you can do, if you so wish, is to put a float stop, say 10-12 inches above your feeder to stop it sliding too far. But that's personal preference. I prefer to keep things as simple as possible with my fishing. And the pellet feeder sets up exactly the same. So let's get down to the actual loading of the feeder. Now the thing to put on first is your hook bait. Now for me today I'm keeping things very simple and will do on 90% of my method feeder fishing or pellet feeder fishing, and stick to dead red maggots, 4mm or 6mm pellets. There are times when you're on big open water fishing for big carp that I'll start to put on like the little mini 6mm boilies, but that's as simple as I want to keep my method feeder fishing hook bait selection. I don't want to be swapping between hundreds of different ones thinking that the next bait might get me a bite. I just want to have the confidence that what I'm doing is working. There are days when pellets are better, and there are days when the maggots are better. And natural hook bait such as a maggot is sometimes a bait that gets sucked up by mistake with the fish that are just feeding on micros. A large standout hook bait can actually be ignored at times. Sometimes you just want something that sort of catches the fish almost by mistake and just gets sucked up with the free offerings. But in this instance, I've been catching on 6mm pellets today. So I'm just gonna slip that into the band like so. A great alternative for the hook is of course double maggot. So I'm going to show you an almost foolproof way to sort your pellets out or your bait out for this style of fishing. Now for me, I like to fish pellets. Ground bait is a great attractor of fish, but I like to keep it to a minimum in my peg, just because although it attracts the fish into your peg, it spreads very easily because of the really fine particles and can actually make it quite difficult to catch fish. So I'm going to stick with micro pellets with ground bait as a small amount of binder just to hold it together. So what we have here, although on the face of things these might look the same, there's actually two different pellets here. One is a skretting, one is a coppins. Now, although they're both micro pellets, they're slightly different. A skrettings pellet will break down far faster and be softer than a coppins pellet. A coppins pellet will stay a lot more whole for a longer period of time and is quite sticky. So what I like to do is combine the two 50-50, just to combine those two properties together. So there we've got two equal amounts. So all we're going to do is put both of them into a tub, mix them together to make sure they're evenly distributed. And then we're going to add some water. Now all we need to do with the water is just cover the pellets, so they're just in enough water. That's slightly too much, I'm going to take a bit out. That's what we're looking for there. And then that's done. And all we're going to do is wait for about 20 minutes to half an hour, and that will soak up the water and be ready for you to start fishing. So at that stage, all you need to do is empty them out into a container and add a small amount of ground bait, and the ground bait just finally binds it together and makes it far easier for you to fish. And this is the end product, which as you can see, what you're looking for is something that with one squeeze will hold together like that. And it's worth noting that the new EVA style bait cases that Middy are producing are perfect for this. Not only is it a great bowl to fish out of, but for when you're not fishing, it's completely waterproof, which not only keeps them dry if it's raining, but also locks the moisture in so those pellets aren't drying out during the meantime. And that makes sure that your preparation that you've done in the morning will continue out throughout the day and you won't have to do any more work with your bait. Now, again, a lot of time and effort has been put into method feeder fishing and its design to make loading it as easy as possible for you. And the Middy mould is one of the best. You've got a central bit at the bottom, which once it's loaded, you press the bottom button, pushes the whole lot out, and that just releases ready for you to cast. So let's go through the process. You put a small amount in at the bottom. You lay the hook bait on the top, making sure the line sits into this slot here. It can be either end. Then you cover that up, pack it in. And then that feeder gets pressed, making sure the line is coming through at a loop from the same end. And you press down hard. And you can pretty much press as hard as you want on this one, because that button at the bottom is always going to release it perfectly for you. and a quick press, and away you go. Perfectly loaded, ready to cast out, and that's not going to fall off. Now you can double load it. You can again fill that mould up again now and press that feeder to get double the amount of bait in. But today that's been about the right amount of bait for me, so I'm not going to do that. And the last thing I've been doing today is actually put in just a small amount of the adrenaline plasma, the aniseed, on the top, just for added attraction. And that's actually really worked for me today. I actually went without a bite for about 20 minutes, half hour, put that on, and it went round within seconds, almost to my own surprise. So check that out. It's definitely a worthy addition to your method feeder fishing. And then it's just a case of casting out to the spot. Loading the pellet feeder is simpler still, but we're still going to adopt a similar principle that we want the hook bait at the front end of the feeder. So the first thing we're going to do is get some bait, pack it in, so it's level with the ridge, and then the hook bait gets placed in there and a small amount placed on top, pressed in with the thumb, and that's ready to cast out. And once that hits the bottom, the pellets will start to absorb some water, and that pressure as they expand will push the bait out into this area here, perfect and ready to hook a carp. So let's move on to the actual fishing aspect. Let's get this pellet feeder sort of loaded up, and we'll go through what we do during the course of a session. So I'm going to feed two lines today, one on the method feeder tight to the island in shallow water, and one at about 20 metres where I'm going to fish the pellet feeder in the deeper water, which is about 3.5 foot. I'm going to loose feed 6mm pellets over the top of it. Now the reason for that is, in the open water the fish are less likely at this time of year in the warm sort of temperatures to congregate and live there without sort of food being introduced. It's an area where they're going to go to eat some bait. So that's why I'm going to start over by the island, because that's where they're going to naturally congregate to begin with during the session. So we start on this. A couple of notes for you when fishing the feeder is, when you first cast, is to be careful to sink the line without moving the feeder at all. You always want all your bait around your hook bait, and by moving that feeder you're going to pull your hook bait potentially away from your little pile, your little trap, which is essential to get a bite. So all we do is we hold the rod, hold the line on your finger so you're feeling for any bites during this time, which can happen, and put a small amount of tension and wait for that line to sink below the surface. And again, that's to do with not moving the feeder. With a breeze, a crosswind, it can catch a floating line and pull your feeder out of position. And the next is where you position your rod. Now many people have feeder rests, etc., and I'm not saying that's wrong, but just for ease, with my setup, I can just lay my rod on my keep net and put it on the side leg, and that's at 45 degrees out to the lake, which is in prime position really to have a small amount of bend in your feeder and recognise a bite, but not be too straight. I always find when you're trying to pull the rod round to the side, it's very difficult to cast because you're all the time trying to keep your rod back as far as possible to hold on to that slack line to bring it round to that 90-degree position. So 45 degrees across your body out into the lake is about right for me. And then, like I said earlier with the trigger tips, you're just trying to keep a small bend in your rod at all times, and that allows you to not only recognise proper bites, which will be a sharp pull round or a drop back and the line will go slack, but also see all the little liners, which are clues as to how many fish are in your peg at any one time. Now, another thing that many people struggle with is how regularly to cast, and unfortunately there is no hard and fast rules. But today I'm fortunate enough to be in a position where I'm on a big shallow plateau out into the lake where I'm fishing on the method feeder. And it's been quite noticeable today when I've been casting that some fish come into your peg straight away. Oh, there's one there. Some fish comes into your peg straight away as soon as I cast out, which tells me, quite obviously, because I can see the fish, that they're reacting to that sound and the bait going into the water. And it's clues like this which help you define what you're going to do during the course of the day. So that tells me every time I cast, I'm attracting some fish into the peg. So if I go through a period of time where I'm not getting many of those indications or fish showing in the swim feeding, then what I'll do is I'll make sure that I'm regularly casting every couple of minutes just to keep that ready supply of sound and food and noise going into the water to attract some fish back into the peg. Now once I've got those fish back, then that's the time then to sort of ease back on the amount that you're casting and sit and wait longer for a bite, because I know there's some fish there feeding over the bait that I'm putting in. So that's the time to sit and wait and make sure you get one. If you try and keep putting more and more food in when there's fish there, you're just going to actually take longer to get a bite, because your hook bait is just like lost more and more in loose particles basically. If, for example, the opposite was occurring, that the fish weren't actually actively seeking out that noise and food, then I'd be casting very infrequently, sort of 10, 15, even 20 minutes, and sitting there and waiting for a bite. Because if they're not actively looking for food, then the more you put into your bait, into your peg, the less likely you are to actually get a bite. Let me just net this fish. And then on the shorter line, I'm going to be loose feeding pellets with a catapult quite regularly, because like I said, it's a line that I'm going to feed quite aggressively, shall we say, to hopefully have a strong finish to the session. Looks like a nice carp, this one. Lovely soft rod at this point, cushions all those lunges and makes sure you get no hook pulls. Nice through action is what you're after with a method rod. Oh, it's actually an F1. It's a big F1, look at him. Oh, that's got to be the biggest F1 in the lake, him. He must be 4 or 5 pound. That proves the effectiveness of the method feeder. So today the session's gone pretty much as planned. We've had a good run on the method feeder for the first part of the session, and now we're finishing off over the top of the loose fed 6mm pellets at 20 metres on the pellet feeder. It's been mainly F1s we've caught today, which is unusual on a lake which is predominantly carp, but with the time of year that's been, the carp have just been spawning. They're a little bit off the feed at the minute, so I suppose it's not to be unexpected. We've had lots of bites, lots of decent sized fish, and an enjoyable day really. I think this one's going to be a big F1. Look at him. Oh. There we go. What a lovely fish to finish the day on. Follow my tips, get out on the bank, and you too could be catching fish like this on the method and pellet feeder. Master your fishing and master those fish.